all the things that within the Bible God gets to do, today are put on the shoulders of human beings. It's God who says, I am who I am, who gets to self-define. Well, now I say in society, I am who I am, I do me. It's God who gets to decide what's good and evil. Well, now we decide what's good and evil. So there's this deification of humanity in modern anthropology. But there's also a second stream of modern anthropology, which is all out on the humbling without any of the dignifying. So it's not uncommon today, in the age of AI, for people to say that fundamentally we are just complicated machines. And we might like to think of ourselves as more than that, but we're fooling ourselves. We're nothing different to extremely complicated machines, and eventually other machines will catch up with us and there'll be no distinction. And so the Christian comes to this modern anthropology and says, okay, well, I've got one choice over here, which is I'm going to think of myself as a God. And I've got another choice over here, which is I'm going to think of myself as a machine. Now, which of those do I choose? Any biblical answer has to be, well, I can't just put all my eggs in one of those baskets. Neither of those are fully biblical. But there's a distorted version of a biblical truth in both of them.
Well, I have a real pleasure of having a conversation I've been looking forward to having for a while now with Christopher Watkin, who received his PhD from the University of Cambridge and is senior lecturer in French studies at Monash University in Melbourne, Australia. His published work really runs the spectrum from academic philosophy to books written for wider audience, both Christian and non-Christian, and include books in the Great Thinkers series on Jacques Derrida, I think of in particular. And the latest book, the one we want to talk about here, is Biblical Critical Theory: How the Bible's Unfolding Story Makes Sense of Modern Life and Culture. Chris, it's great to have you on the White Horse Inn.
Mike, it's a joy to be here. I know we've been trying to arrange this for a little while, and it's wonderful that it's finally come to pass. So it's a delight to be with you.
Well, out of the gate, I'll bet you get this a lot. What is biblical and critical theory? What are those words doing on the same cover? Can you first of all help us understand critical theory, bandied about, waved around, but not largely explored or explained? Could you give us a little background on critical theory and then the biblical critical theory that you have in mind?
Absolutely. Here's where I'm going. By the end of this answer, I want to try and convince you and your listeners that critical theory cannot be other than biblical. So that's the end point. Let's put some building blocks in place to get there.
Great.
So there are two senses of critical theory that circulate in our society. And one of them is sucking all the oxygen away from the other. The one that's sucking the oxygen is a very narrow sense of critical theory that's really arisen only in the last, say, 2-3 decades. And it's the sort of idea of critical race theory. That's the way in which it's most usually presented in the media. It's quite a specific set of concerns about how society ought to look and how we ought to reorder it. But this is really the tip of an iceberg. And it's really hard to understand that narrow sense unless you've got a bigger picture. So the broader sense of critical theory, and the one that I grew up learning, so when I did an undergraduate unit on critical theory at university, it was this broader sense that was meant, was a series of philosophies that have arisen sort of in the wake of Immanuel Kant, I guess, that all seek to set limits on what we can know and critique the way that society currently is. So in the unit that I did on critical theory, we had Simone de Beauvoir in there and her second wave feminism. We had Derrida, we had Foucault, we had Deleuze. I think we had Frantz Fanon. And all of these people in very different ways are trying to show how society is unjust in particular ways and show a vision for how society could be better. And that, I think, is the key sense of critical theory that can help make sense of it for Christians. And then you asked, what is the biblical critical theory? Well, first of all, let's just think about it historically. where did this sort of thinking originally arise? As a matter of fact, as a matter of historical record. The Augustine scholar, Charles Matthews, the University of Virginia, has an argument that I found incredibly thrilling and incredibly persuasive, which is that the first time in the Western tradition that you get a culture critiqued in its entirety, so not a little bit of a culture, not this thing that we do or that tradition is wrong, but the whole of a culture, critiqued from a point outside of it, is Augustine's City of God. Nobody did that previous to Augustine. He's taking the whole of Roman society and systematically critiquing it from a biblical lens. So you could say, historically speaking, the origin of what we call cultural critique today just happens to be Christian, just as a matter of historical record. But I think there's a stronger argument to make. And it's that it's very hard to do this properly without something like Christianity in the background. And I think the reason is this. In order to critique a culture and to say what's wrong with it, you've got to have a measure of what's right and wrong. To know which bits of it you want to critique, you've got to have a measure of justice and injustice. Where are you going to get that from? Well, Christianly speaking, we get it from the biblical story. So there's a rupture in history between creation and fall. It was very good, beginning of Genesis 2, and then sin enters the world. And so we've got a sense of what things are like when they're working well, what a very good world looks like. And then again, at the end of Revelation, you've got this rupture of the final judgment, and you've got a picture of, every tongue, tribe, and nation around the throne of the Lamb, and what things look like when they're perfect. And so the Christian can come to society and say, there are certain things that we do that are unjust. And it's not just me thinking they're unjust. It's not just a feeling that I have. It's that objectively speaking, these things, regardless of who thinks so or not, are unjust. And if everybody in the world thought that they were just, they could still be unjust. But if I don't have a story like that, with these ruptures between creation and fall and then redemption and consummation, all I've got is what there is. And so the only way that I can critique society is by taking one bit of what there is and using it as a measure against which to measure other bits of what there is. And the problem with that is that there's no way to arbitrate which bit of what there is to use as the measure. Let me just give a quick example, because that's quite an abstract idea. So before the French Revolution, in the Ancien Régime, there was absolute monarchy. So Louis XIV was this very sort of centralized monarch. And this was, for the people at the time, completely natural. Because, well, look up at the heavens. There's one sun at the center of the solar system, and everything revolves around that one sun. This is the way that nature has set things up. So this is the way that we should organize our society in order to cut with the grain of how things are of nature. And then fast forward to the middle of the 20th century, and you've got a radical French philosopher like Gilles Deleuze, and he makes the argument that actually difference is more fundamental than identity in the world, just ontologically speaking. And therefore, we should privilege difference in our politics and in our culture. Now, they're radically different views of society, but they're using the same principle, taking one bit of what there is and using it as a measure for the rest of what there is. And so who's right? Is the Ancien Régime right, looking up at the solar system? Or is Deleuze right, with difference being more fundamental than identity? Well, in a sense, there's no way to arbitrate that. It's just both of them are taking a bit of what there is and using it to measure the rest of what there is. And the problem, therefore, that you get to is the only way that one of those views can win is by speaking more loudly for longer than the other view, and preferably stopping the other view from talking altogether. There's no measure to be able to weigh those two views of the world up. And so the Christian, thankfully, is not in that position, because the measure of what is just and unjust is not taken out of the status quo, for the Christian. It comes from a moment of history that's radically distinct from how things are now. And therefore, to circle back on what has, I'm afraid, been a rather long answer to your very succinct question.
It has to be.
In order to do cultural critique, you need something like what the Christian has. Otherwise, it's just people shouting at each other, and the person who shouts loudest with the most weapons behind them for longest wins. And there's a sense in 20th century cultural critique that this is recognized, not in the Christian sense, but there's a need for some sort of measure that's not just me feeling or thinking something's wrong. And there's a really interesting moment towards the end of a book called Minima Moralia by Theodor Adorno, who's one of the Frankfurt School critical theorists, the people who get called sometimes today cultural Marxists. And he says, what we need in order to do cultural critique properly is, quote, a standpoint of redemption, close quote. Now, he's no Christian, and he's not opening the door to Christianity there. But it's interesting that he reaches for that theological language in order to talk about where you need to stand in order to do authentic cultural critique. And there's a sense, I think, in which he speaks more truly than he knows at that point. Because without a standpoint of redemption, it is always taking one bit of what there is to measure the rest of what there is and say that it's unjust. And then someone else takes another bit of what there is and makes a different measurement. And where do you go from there?
So very often when we're talking to people on the street about creation, fall, redemption, consummation as our unfolding story, the unfolding story of reality, they have in mind a meta-narrative of progress, moving from the age of faith and superstition and magic to the age of reason and science. You're saying that we have a better story, a deeper, richer, and truer story by which to critique that march of history view that they may not even know they have, much less where they got it.
I think that's right. I mean, there are a number of different arguments you could make on different levels there. One of the strongest would be, and I hope I'm getting this right, I think it's Oliver O'Donovan who makes the argument that you can't have a story at all unless there's something outside it, because it just becomes a chronicle, a succession of events with no meaning. So from his point of view, in order to have anything like a story, you need an overall shape to it that's given by something outside of it. And so that, I think he would say in response to the question that you just asked, you can't have a story at all without Christianity. You've just got stuff that happens and you can't ascribe any meaning to it. But I guess a weaker argument would be what makes the Christian story stand out from something like the story of progress, the Enlightenment story of progress, is these ruptures in it. So the Enlightenment story of progress is sort of a story of cause and effect. And it can all happen within a closed system where you set things up at the beginning and then the clockwork starts running, to use a schematic metaphor. And then things work themselves out over time. Conditions become causes that have effects that become causes that have effects. What's, I think, delicious about the Christian story is that it's not a closed system. And it has definitive breaks in it, like the rupture between creation and fall is a qualitative change in the world. So it's not just human beings that change at that point. There's in Genesis 3, it's very clear that the whole world changes qualitatively, the thorns and thistles in the field and so on. And so something happens in the strongest possible philosophical sense of happening at that point. It's an event. And similarly with redemption, the New Testament talks about it in terms of a new creation. Something as significant as going from nothing to everything happens in redemption. You can't raise the stakes higher than that in terms of something happening in the story. And therefore the Christian story is not just a different story, but it's a different type of story. It's got dimensions to it that the story of progress doesn't have. And
tragedy and comedy.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely, Mike. And the final piece of that jigsaw, I think, is that in the Christian story, things happen that are not simply the outworking of conditions that are already present in the situation. And that is incredibly good news because it gives us hope. And one of the key examples of this, and it's almost an example that I think the more you let it dwell with you, the more it brings a tear to your eye, is the way in which the Noah narrative is introduced in Genesis 6. So you've got this inexorable, excruciating descent into sin from Genesis 3 to 6. You've got the first murder, Cain slaying Abel. You've got this awful character, Lamech, who boasts about, his domination of women and his prowess on the battlefield. It just gets worse and worse. And then you get that terrible verse in Genesis 6, the Lord regretted that he'd made the world and all the thoughts of people's hearts were only evil all the time. You think, oh my goodness, this is going to be a short book. Like, I can't see how this can end anything other than tragically. And then you've got that verse that is like so left field. It is the dictionary definition of left field. Noah found favor, word can also be translated grace, in the eyes of the Lord. You think, what? Whoa.
Mm-hmm.
Slow down. Like, excuse me? He found what? Where? Like, where did that come from? And then you get one of those Toledo sayings, those chapter breaks in Genesis. And then these are the generations of Noah, and it explains what he did. But the finding grace bit comes in the previous chapter. Like, there's no, let me tell you a little bit about Noah. Let me set things up. It's like literally, bang. He found grace. Like, who is he? Where did he come from? What is this grace he found? And it's just so typically God.
Yeah,
you read the rest of the Bible. Sorry, Mike?
No, it reminds me of Ephesians 2, where it starts out so bleakly, dead in trespasses and sins, children of wrath, but God.
Yeah, exactly.
Rich in grace.
It is exactly that. And it's all over the Bible.
Yeah.
So it's the idea that we are not left to our own devices. Our story is not written by us alone, biblically speaking, which is jolly good news because we're not very good at writing our story.
Yeah.
We tend to destroy ourselves and go to war all the time and be selfish in ways that are really obnoxious and the weakest and the most vulnerable among us suffer from perpetually. And so this idea of God intervening in human stories out of sheer grace, literally out of nowhere, is so characteristic of the biblical story. It's what in the book I call one of these biblical figures, which just means something that keeps happening over and over again. It's like the signature move of the Bible. So it's there in Genesis 6, it's there in Ephesians 2, it's all over. God intervenes in grace for good, to bring hope. And that
you talk about these rhythms, these patterns, like promise and fulfillment, and tree of life in the beginning in Genesis, tree of life, the end in Revelation. You have these rhythms, like we have the rhythm of the Lord's Day, and seem to do the same things every week. And wonder, but it's part of a rhythm. Is that sort of what you're talking about here? We begin to see patterns that make sense of. Well, we see episodes of an unfolding drama instead of disjointed things that happen for no reason in between the lucky chance of humans emerging from the swamp and the whimper that ends it all.
Completely. God has a character, and he acts in accordance with that character. And the biblical story has moves that are made over and over again, that I call figures in the book. And one of them is grace. And in the same way that, you read a page of Ernest Hemingway, within a paragraph that it's Hemingway. He just has his way of writing. Or you read a chapter of Jane Austen and you think that is unmistakably Jane Austen. There's something that is unmistakably God about the way that he deals with his people, and you read a couple of books of the Bible, and you get to know the rhythms and the repeated patterns of the way that this story is working. And it's so knitted together, isn't it? There's this lovely book called Echoes of Exodus by Alistair Roberts and Andrew Wilson, where they're saying that the Exodus story just echoes throughout the Bible, throughout the New Testament. It keeps the rhythms of that story just keep coming back again and again. That's just one example of the way in which these figures shape the biblical story. And as we as Christians lean into and live out these figures, we're, if you sort of want to use this language, cutting with the grain of the Bible or resonating with a biblical view of the world in a really profound way. If we think, how do I body forth and embrace and rejoice in this wonderful reality of grace that keeps coming again and again in the Bible in my own life? How do I become a grace-shaped person? There's a wonderful depth in that. It's a really profound, challenging question to ask of ourselves, and a thoroughly and richly biblical one.
How do I live out being part of the Exodus?
Exactly. Yeah, I have been freed from bondage, from slavery. But I've been freed for a relationship. So it's not just this modern sense of negative freedom that Isaiah Berlin put his finger on, which is, I've been freed from all constraints. Now what? It's, let my people go that they may serve me. And now I have found the master who truly has my best interests at heart. So I can serve my career, or I can serve my body image, or I can serve any number of things in contemporary society. But none of those are kind masters. None of them have my best interests at heart. My job is fine, but it doesn't love me. My self-image, in fact, doesn't love me. It's a very harsh judge. Social media doesn't love me. There's no master, so to speak, out there who laid down his life for me, who demonstrated his commitment to me so profoundly, and who both knows how to bring life to the full and is determined to bring me life. So how foolish I would be to mortgage my future to anyone apart from this master who's demonstrated how committed to me he is.
One of the ways you show just how superior it is to be justified by God's work rather than ours is how we tell each other, be yourself, which, as you point out so well, is really to tell people to surrender to the market with, as you put it, its narrow portfolio of monetized identity options. What a pregnant phrase. Can you unpack that?
There's an irony in the modern discourse around identity and freedom, I think. And it's this. It's that we are told in many different ways each day to go your own way, to be yourself. In the same way that, turn the clock back 100 years and people were being told many different ways each day, do your duty. And so if we'd have gone back, say 1916 England, middle of the First World War, and we'd have gone around talking to people in the streets and said, what do you want for your life? A lot of them would have said, I want to do my duty. And then we'd follow up with the question, why do you want to do your duty? And they would probably answer, well, that's just what I want. And we'd say, well, don't you think that in a society where you're being told 100 times every day to do your duty, that's sort of what you're inevitably going to say? And it would be interesting to see what they responded. Turn the clock forward to our own day, go out into the street and say to people, what do you want for your life? And often the message will be some version of, I want to go my own way. I want to be my own person. I don't want them, whoever they are, to tell me who I am and what to do. And then we watch a few commercials together and look round in the way that society is ordered. And we say, well, that's sort of the message you're being given every day. And so where did that come from? And in the same way that the person in the society of duty can't really tell whether it's their own idea or whether it's simply what they've been told, what they've been catechized into believing. Today, we can't tell the difference anymore between me deciding in the sort of, to use romantic language, in the depths of my own breast, so to speak, that yes, this is what I want for me. And simply this is the way we're being catechized today. And a second aspect of this that I think really evokes pathos is that this idea of going your own way is then really expertly and ruthlessly marketized. So we are sold our own identity today. And there are sort of obvious ways in which this happens.
It's under the pretense of us choosing.
Absolutely it is. So I once gave a talk on this, and I did some research and dug up all the different automobile adverts that had used the language of go your own way. There are 11 of them. So 11 different car companies saying go your own way. So what's the message there? It's if you buy our particular brand of mass-produced automobile, you will be your own person. You say it out like that, it's laughable, it's ridiculous, but it sells cars. That's why that language is used. People buy it, buy that message. And there are lots of examples today of mass-produced products that are sold with the message of you will be an individual, you will be your own person if you buy this. And just to say it out loud like that shows the irony of it. Like, why? Like, why buying this brand of clothing will make me more my own person than buying the other brand of clothing? And so there's a sense, therefore, in which that Bible verse that is true of Christians, you are not your own, you were bought with a price, is actually true in a very different way of modern identity construction, in that you think you own yourself, you think you are yourself to make of what you want, but actually the market owns you. You are owned. You are constructing an identity from the options that are offered to you that are all monetized options. And I think it's important to say that people like me who would sometimes like to think of ourselves as outside that economy, I don't buy all the top brands, I'm not like that. We do that too. No. There are, identity options that are slightly eccentric academic rather than, sort of extremely fashionable person. And so none of us can escape from that logic today.
We all have algorithms.
Well, absolutely. We're all constructing our identity through our purchases. And if you say, well, I'm not going to do that, that becomes itself an identity option among the others. It's what Peter Berger called the heretical imperative. There comes a point where not to choose becomes a choice. You can't escape.
One of the things I really appreciate about your whole approach is that, especially when we think in the Anglo-American setting, especially in the United States, evangelical apologetics is often, what do you say to someone who asks this question or who asks that question, which assumes that they're already reflective about where you go when you die and other questions. What I really like about your approach, of course, I'm partial to the continental tradition too, but Ricoeur especially, you talk a lot about phenomenology. What happens before? What are the pre-understandings? Not just what is objectively there, what is objectively true, but how I see it, how I experience it. Can you talk about that a little bit, about how the same event can be experienced by two people as something different?
The way that I come at this through the book is with Charles Taylor's idea, and also other people have had this idea too in the French tradition, of social imaginaries. And he describes it as something like the implicit sense of how the world works, how things go, what you should expect in certain situations. And it's not a series of concepts, but it's just a sense of the way the world rolls, the way the world works. And it shapes what we're sensitive to in the world. So think of it in terms of our perception is always in terms of a figure on a ground. So when I see something, there's something I'm paying attention to. So at the moment, it's your picture on the screen in front of me. And there's lots of things that are in my peripheral vision that I'm not paying attention to. Because I can't pay attention to everything. I've got to make choices. There's just too much information coming in for me to pay attention to everything. Or think of it in terms of listening to a conversation in a crowded room. You focus on one particular voice, and therefore you can't hear any of the other voices, but you could choose to focus on the others. If you did, you'd hear what they were saying. You can only focus on a small amount of what's presented to you. So we're all making these choices in terms of perception all the time. But we're also making choices in a broader sense. So there are a number of things that I could pay attention to, a number of causes, a number of values in the world, and I make choices on that basis. So do I want to watch this YouTube video or that one? Do I want to spend my money in this way or that way? Do I want to go to this meeting or that meeting? What conversation do I want to raise with my wife and kids over the dinner table? That, 3 or 4 in my mind. Which am I going to choose? So we're all making these choices all the time. And over time, as we become used to making certain choices, there are certain things out in the world that become visible to us, that stand out for us, and other things that sort of retreat into the background. And there are certain things in the world that become more valuable to us, that we want to either conserve or that we want to condemn, and other things that just become part of the noise, part of the background. And so two people who have got different sensitivities, for whom different things out there in the world are in the foreground, different things in the background, will experience the same event and see different things in it because they're choosing to pay attention to different elements of that very complex situation. And so you talk to them both afterwards, and it seems like they saw completely unrelated things.
Can you give an example?
Yeah, so a bunch of people marching down a street with placards. And it doesn't, for the purposes of this illustration, matter what they're demonstrating about, but they're demonstrating about something. And so one person is saying, this is such a hopeful moment for democracy in our nation. Finally, people are finding their voice. They're rising up against the oppressions that are keeping them down. And I'm buzzing. I'm so full of excitement over this. Another person will say, this is the most terrifying thing I've seen in years. The very basis of our social order is being threatened by these people who are wanting to take the law into their own hands and bypass the checks and balances and safeguards that allow us to live together as a properly functioning democracy. And I feel fear at this point. And they've seen exactly the same thing, but they've coded it. They've processed it in very, very different ways as a function of their own sensibility.
And so these are figures, just as in the Bible, you have the figures that you were describing. You have these figures. The sign attaches meaning to what is happening, and that is different for different people.
Yes, and figures are patterns and rhythms of experience. So if I've grooved a certain pattern of experience enough times, I'm going to look for it in new circumstances. And that's one way of understanding what happened when these two different people saw this crowd marching down the street with placards.
And you're not even aware that this is a belief. You're not even aware.
Yeah, very often not. That's right.
It's just the world, the way reality.
Or it's just common sense. Like, yes, obviously that was what was going on. How ridiculous to suggest that it could have been anything else.
So this is part of the critical in critical theory, that you're I think as I'm reading the book, I really hear a lot of a lot of people, Augustine and a lot of other people, but Ricoeur, if I may get your take on this. So Hans Georg Gadamer has this view of the fusion of horizons that has really caught on in evangelical hermeneutics. You have the horizon of the text, and then the horizon of the contemporary reader. And in order to understand, there must be a fusion of those horizons. Ricoeur comes at that and says, no, more often than not, there's a clash of horizons. And that can be productive if we really listen to each other. A clash of horizons, it really respects the other as different. The two horizons merging is kind of me taking over, absorbing the other to myself. But Ricoeur, it's respecting the otherness of the difference of that position. I just think his defense of the hermeneutics of suspicion as a Christian, even a reformed, whatever sort of reformed Christian, here he is, the professor, supervisor of Jacques Derrida, and Ricoeur says we as Christians have more reason to have a hermeneutics of suspicion than Nietzsche and Marx, because we understand how we systematically suppress the truth and unrighteousness. Is that an example of the sort of critical theory, biblical critical theory, that you think needs to go on today?
I think it is, Mike. And I think the way to understand that in a healthy way to understand that is that for Ricoeur, this is always part of a story. So I think the difference between Ricoeur and Gadamer is that Ricoeur emplots, and that's his word, this suspicion. And so there's a first moment of naivety. Well, of course, this is the way things are. How ridiculous. What are Marx and Freud and Nietzsche and anybody else? What's the Bible talking about? I know how the world works. And then there's a moment of suspicion, which is a moment of, radical self-questioning. Whoa, wait a minute. Am I justified in all these assumptions that I've made? Perhaps I've got things wrong. Perhaps, I've had the wool over my eyes. Perhaps I've been prey to some ideology. But for Ricoeur, a healthy movement will always come out, in a sense, the other side of that with what he calls a second naivety, which is not the same as the first one, but it's chastened, it's self-critical, it's been humbled in that way, but it's still a conviction. It's not that now I don't know what's true, but it's now I've come, in a sense, to a more robust holding to what I believe to be true, because it's gone through that fire of suspicion and critique. But it's also humbled. So it's this beautiful combination, and Tim Keller was wonderful in capturing this, wasn't he? Mm-hmm. That there's both a great unshakable conviction about among Christians about the truth, but there's also a great humility in holding it, and both of those together characterize this second naivety.
Mm. I mentioned Augustine just a moment ago. Obviously, his City of God was an inspiration for you, although you start with the second part, the second half of the City of God, which is him presenting the Christian alternative, and then you go to the critique. What are some of the similarities between Augustine's City of God and your book?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that his is orders of magnitude better. I mean, it is, well, but it is a book for the ages, isn't it? I think it is still the most brilliant example of cultural critique in the history of the Christian church outside the Bible. And he bases
one of the earliest, right?
Well, also the earliest, and therefore all the more astonishing that it is, I think, still the best. And saying that, he profoundly bases it on Revelation, so he's drawing on biblical wells to do that, the book of Revelation. I think what I'm trying to do is follow his pattern of critiquing the whole of a culture. So not simply parachuting down like some sort of SWAT team and neutralizing this aspect of culture or that aspect of culture that we think is problematic, and then airlifting ourselves out at the other end and thinking we've done the job. Because culture is an ecosystem. Ideas need each other to exist and to make sense of them. So you've got to look at the whole of culture. The second way I try to follow his pattern is to use the whole of the Bible. So not just picking purple passages or reading everything through creation or everything through the fall, but letting each key moment of the biblical story play its part in shaping a cultural critique. And then there's also the posture of the critic. And I've tried to adopt what I think Augustine does brilliantly, which is to be both an insider and an outsider to the culture. So he's an insider in the sense that he's taught rhetoric in Carthage and Rome. Like people go to him to know what Cicero says, you know. And he can articulate that very persuasively. There are moments in the City of God where he says, look, Cicero is a really good writer. And so he knows why Roman culture sparkles to those inside that culture. He's an insider in that sense. But he's also a radical outsider, partly because of his biographical details. So, he's North African. He's not from modern day Italy. His mother is a wonderful Christian lady, Monica. His father's a pagan. So he's sort of outsider biographically, but profoundly, more importantly than that, he's an outsider because he sees the world through biblical lenses, not through Rome's own lens. And therefore, Rome always seems weird, often quite comical to him. And so he's got these eyes of an outsider that allow you to see things that a consummate insider can't. And it's that combination of being both an insider and an outsider that I think is just incredibly powerful as a posture for cultural critique, and that I've tried in my own small way to replicate in this book.
I was intrigued by your notion of diagonal analysis. I had never heard that term before, as a challenge to all of the binary oppositions that we come up with. You're either on this side or you're that side. You either think this or you think it's direct opposite. How does your method help us think differently, not just about this issue or that issue, but it's in general about cultural critique? We need to think better. We need to have more mature guidance and wisdom in how to analyze the world in which we live.
I think we always do, don't we? Yes, in absolutely in every generation. What I'm labeling diagonalization, I don't think is new. I think it's there in the Bible itself. Parable of the prodigal son, I think, is one of the key moments where we see it. And we can go back to that if you want in a moment. I think it's there in the history of the church. I think Augustine is doing it. What I've tried to do is put a label on it so we can see it and use it. Because a lot of these things, these brilliant moves that Christians have made in the past, if we don't have a word for them, we miss them. We just read the City of God and think, wow, that was amazing. Like, how did he do that? So what I'm trying to do is package up this thing that Christians have been doing for 2,000 years and put a label on it so that we can say, oh, that's what it is. That's what it looks like. That's how I might be able to use it. To explain what it is, let me try and use an example. So in Genesis 1, we've got this beautiful motif of the image of God, human beings made in the image of God. And one way of thinking about it is that there are two complementary, harmonious aspects to that. One is that it gives great dignity to human beings because of all that exists in the rich panoply of creation, much of it wonderful and breathtaking. Only human beings are made in the image of God. That is a huge dignity in the created order. But there's also a sense in which that same motif humbles human beings because we're the image. We're not the God of whom the image is. We're contingent, we're derivative. In order to understand who we are, you've got to go to the God in whose image we are. And there's no sense in Genesis 1 that those two things are pulling against each other. There's no sense in which we're like half dignified and half humble. And then you go to modern anthropology. And one way of thinking about that is that there are two tendencies, each of which foregrounds one of these aspects of the image of God. So one way to think about human beings today is effectively as gods. And John Milbank makes this argument in Theology and Social Theory. So all the things that within the Bible God gets to do today are put on the shoulders of human beings. It's God who says, I am who I am, who gets to self-define. Well, now I say in society, I am who I am, I do me. It's God who gets to decide what's good and evil. Well, now we decide what's good and evil. So there's this deification of humanity in modern anthropology. But there's also a second stream of modern anthropology, which is all out on the humbling without any of the dignifying. So it's not uncommon today, in the age of AI, for people to say that fundamentally we are just complicated machines. And we might like to think of ourselves as more than that, but we're fooling ourselves. We're nothing different to extremely complicated machines, and eventually other machines will catch up with us and there'll be no distinction. And that's very humbling. It puts us in our place, but it gives us no inherent dignity. And so the Christian comes to this modern anthropology and says, okay, well, I've got one choice over here, which is I'm going to think of myself as a god. And I've got another choice over here, which is I'm going to think of myself as a machine. Now, which of those do I choose? Which of those does the Bible reflect? And any biblical answer has to be, well, I can't just put all my eggs in one of those baskets. Neither of those are fully biblical. But there's a distorted version of a biblical truth in both of them. Yes, I am dignified. Yes, I am different to the rest of matter in that I'm made in the image of God. And in a twisted, broken way, the idea that I am a God is sort of reaching for, trying to grasp some of that specialness. And yes, I am created on the same day as the other animals, on day 6 in Genesis 1. And there's an earthiness to me. I'm made from the dust of the ground. And so the idea that I'm just a machine or just an animal is, again, a broken, twisted, partial grasping at something that's there in the Bible. So how do you relate to these two dichotomous anthropologies? Well, to diagonalize them, to use that language, is to say, I'm going to choose neither of them, but I'm going to show how both of them are dismembered limbs of a beautiful biblical reality of the image of God. How they're ripping aspects of the image of God apart from each other and making them the whole story. So I'm not splitting the difference. I'm not saying the Christian view is that I'm half God and half machine. Like what would that even mean? That doesn't make sense. I'm saying that these are derivative, reductive distortions of a beautiful, harmonious biblical truth. So we need to get behind this false dichotomy to the biblical reality that it's misrepresenting. And we need to, in a sense, draw and point towards the way in which dignity and humility marry perfectly in a biblical frame, and how that's actually a really healthy way to think about human beings, and a more socially rich way than either of these two dichotomous tendencies that we see in contemporary anthropology.
Well, folks, I don't know about you, but the more I hear Christopher Watkin talk about his approach to unfolding the whole biblical narrative and seeing what wonderful, joyful things it does to deconstruct and reconstruct our ways of thinking is just luminous. I have read the book, and I encourage everybody to go out there and read it. It's not easy. You have to commit to it. It's a big book, and there are some dense parts in this book, but they're worth the effort. You will be glad that you took the pains to get through the difficult parts. As you can see from this interview, you're hearing all kinds of things, perhaps that you've never even heard before, about how to approach the culture in which we live. And can't think of a time in which, since Augustine's day, we needed to be more faithful in thinking through how Christians, distinctly as Christians, can evaluate their own presuppositions, not just us versus them, but to realize that we too have been conformed to the pattern of this passing age. I love your conclusion, Chris, when you say, I am painfully aware of the gaps in this present volume. Do I not understand the richness of the sacrificial system? Have I not even heard of the Holy Spirit? Do I simply not care about all the harm Christians have caused in history? Would someone please give me some Aquinas or some African theology to read? In my defense, I can only say, if you see something missing, add it. If you see something broken, fix it. Thanks for joining us, Chris.
It's been a great pleasure, Mike. Thank you so much.